The socket wrench slipped from Tasha's grease-stained fingers, clanging against the concrete floor of Valley View Auto Service. For 15 years, she had been just another mechanic in Harmony Springs, Wyoming, until 3 Green Berets walked into her garage and spotted something that would shatter her carefully constructed anonymity forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the oil-stained concrete as Natasha Burke wiped her hands on a faded shop rag. At 42, Tasha had the kind of quiet competence that came from years of working with her hands, fixing what others couldn't. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her coveralls bore the honest stains of someone who actually did the work rather than just supervised it. Valley View Auto Service sat on the edge of Harmony Springs, a town of barely 3,000 souls nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted attention, which was exactly why Tasha had chosen it 15 years ago when she'd arrived with nothing but a duffel bag, a set of tools, and secrets she intended to take to her grave. "Tasha, you got that Chevy ready?" called Eddie Kowalski from his office, his Polish accent still thick after 30 years in Wyoming. Eddie owned the shop and had given Tasha a job when she'd shown up all those years ago, desperate and skilled in equal measure. "Just finishing up the transmission flush," she replied, sliding out from under the pickup truck. Her movements were precise, economical, the kind of efficiency that spoke of discipline learned somewhere other than a garage. The bell above the front door chimed, and Tasha glanced up to see 3 men entering the shop. Even in civilian clothes, everything about them screamed military. Their posture was ramrod straight, their eyes constantly scanning, and they moved with the controlled confidence of soldiers who had seen combat. The lead man was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying temples and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. "Help you, gentlemen?" Eddie asked, emerging from his office with a coffee-stained mug in his hand. "We need work done on our vehicle," the lead man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Nothing fancy, just routine maintenance and a diagnostic check. We're passing through on our way to Fort Carson." Logan Hayes, one of Tasha's co-workers, looked up from the engine he was working on. Logan was 26 earnest and had been trying to ask Tasha out for the better part of 2 years. "What kind of vehicle?" he asked. "Modified Humvey," the second man replied. He was younger, maybe early 30s, with the lean build of a distance runner. "Military surplus, but we've made some adjustments." Antonio Gutierrez whistled low from his station across the garage. Tony was pushing 50, had 3 kids, and knew more about diesel engines than anyone had a right to. "Those things can be tricky. You sure you want small-town mechanics working on military hardware?" The third soldier, barely out of his 20s but carrying himself like a veteran, smirked. "No offense, but we're not exactly dealing with rocket science here. It's basic maintenance." Tasha felt her jaw tighten at the dismissive tone, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when fighting them meant drawing attention. She couldn't afford. "I can handle it," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. The lead soldier, his bearing suggested he was the senior. NCO turned his attention to her for the first time. His gray eyes were sharp, assessing. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but this vehicle requires someone with experience in military systems." "She's got plenty of experience," Logan said defensively, earning him a grateful glance from Tasha that he completely missed. "I'm sure she's competent with civilian vehicles," the young soldier said with condescending patience. "But military modifications are different. They require specialized knowledge." Caleb Fisher, the 4th mechanic in the shop, looked up from his paperwork. Caleb was quiet, methodical, and had never seen a problem he couldn't solve given enough time and the right manual. Tasha's diagnosed problems that stumped factory-trained technicians, he said. If anyone can figure out your truck, it's her. The soldiers exchanged glances, and Tasha could practically hear their unspoken conversation. They saw a middle-aged woman in coveralls working in a small-town garage, and they'd made their assumptions accordingly. Look, the senior NCO said, his tone diplomatic but firm. We appreciate the confidence in your colleague, but we're on a timeline. Maybe your most experienced mechanic could take a look? Eddie stepped forward, his face flushing red. Tasha's been working here longer than anyone except me. She's forgotten more about engines than most people ever learn. It's fine, Eddie, Tasha said, her voice steady despite the familiar sting of being dismissed. I'm sure they know what's best for their vehicle. But as she spoke, she caught sight of the Humvey through the open bay door. Even from a distance, she could see the telltale signs of aftermarket armor plating, the slight modification to the suspension that suggested additional weight, and the antenna configuration that spoke of sophisticated communication equipment. It was the kind of setup she'd seen before, in places far from Wyoming, under circumstances she'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Actually, she found herself saying, that looks like a up-armored M1114. The transmission in those has a tendency to overheat when you add the additional armor weight without upgrading the cooling system. You might want to check the transmission fluid temperature before you drive it hard. The three soldiers went very still. The kind of stillness that preceded either violence or very pointed questions. The senior NCO studied her with new interest. That's specific knowledge for a civilian mechanic. Tasha realized her mistake immediately. She'd spent 15 years being careful, being invisible, being just another small-town mechanic. In 30 seconds, she'd revealed knowledge that raised questions she wasn't prepared to answer. I read a lot, she said lamely, turning back to the Chevy as if the conversation was over, but it wasn't over. She could feel their eyes on her, could sense the shift in their attention from polite dismissal to genuine curiosity. In the military, coincidences were rare and suspicious knowledge was investigated. The young soldier walked to the bay door and studied the Humvey more carefully. Ma'am, he called back, how did you know it was an M114 from here? The model designation isn't visible from this angle. Tasha's hands stilled on her wrench. She'd identified the vehicle from its proportions, its stance, the subtle differences that only came from intimate familiarity with military hardware. It was knowledge. She shouldn't have expertise that didn't belong in a civilian garage. Lucky guess, she said. But even to her own ears, it sounded unconvincing. The senior NCO approached her workstation, his boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. Ma'am, I'm Command Sergeant Major Brett Lawson, United States Army Special Forces. These are Staff Sergeant Hunter Phillips and Sergeant First Class Wade Turner. His voice had shifted to something more formal, more official. Would you mind taking a look at our vehicle? I have a feeling you might know more about it than we initially assumed. It wasn't really a request, and they all knew it. Tasha set down her tools and stood, wiping her hands on her coveralls. After 15 years of hiding, of being invisible, of letting others underestimate her, she was about to walk into a situation that could unravel everything she'd built. But as she followed the three Green Berets toward their modified Humvey, she couldn't shake the feeling that part of her, the part she'd been suppressing for a decade and a half, was almost relieved that the charade might finally be over. The Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly as Tasha approached the modified Humvey, her boots crunching on the gravel parking lot. Up close, the vehicle was even more impressive and familiar than she'd initially realized. The armor plating had been expertly integrated. The communication array was military grade, and the subtle modifications to the suspension and drivetrain spoke of someone who understood both the vehicle's capabilities and limitations. Command Sergeant Major Lawson watched her carefully as she circled the Humvey, his gray eyes missing nothing. "Take your time," he said, though his tone suggested this was anything but a casual inspection. Tasha ran her hands along the vehicle's frame, her fingers automatically finding stress points and potential failure areas. It was muscle memory, the kind of knowledge that came from years of working on similar vehicles under conditions where failure meant more than inconvenience, it meant lives lost. "Your cooling system's been upgraded," she observed, crouching near the front grille, "but you're still running the standard transmission cooler. With this much additional weight, you're asking for trouble on long hauls or in high-temperature environments." Staff Sergeant Phillips exchanged a glance with his commander. Most civilian mechanics wouldn't know about transmission cooling issues on military vehicles. Most civilian mechanics haven't seen what happens when a transmission fails in the middle of nowhere, Tasha replied without thinking, then immediately regretted the words. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Logan, Tony, and Caleb had gathered near the bay door, ostensibly working, but obviously listening to every word. Eddie had emerged from his office, his weathered face creased with concern. Sergeant First Class Turner, the youngest of the three soldiers, stepped forward. "Ma'am, that sounds like you're speaking from experience." Tasha straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I've read about it. Military maintenance manuals are available online if you know where to look." "Ah, they?" Lawson's voice carried a note of skepticism. "Turner, why don't you pop the hood? Let's see what our knowledgeable mechanic thinks about the engine modifications." The hood opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing an engine compartment that was both familiar and foreign to Tasha's coworkers. To her, it was like looking at an old photograph. Every component, every modification, every potential problem area was exactly where she expected it to be. "You've got an upgraded air filtration system," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Smart modification for desert operations. The fuel injection system's been tuned for different altitudes, probably for mountain operations. And you've added a secondary oil cooler, which is good because the standard system can't handle the additional stress from the armor weight." She paused, studying a particular component near the back of the engine bay. "But whoever did this work made a mistake. See this line here?" She pointed to a hydraulic line that ran along the engine block. "It's too close to the exhaust manifold. In high-stress situations, with the engine running hot, that line's going to degrade faster than it should. You'll get hydraulic fluid leaking onto the exhaust. And best-case scenario, you're looking at smoke and reduced performance. Worst case, you've got a fire," Lawson finished quietly. "Exactly." Tasha's assessment was matter-of-fact, professional. "It's not an immediate danger, but it's something you'll want to address before your next deployment." The word deployment hung in the air like a smoking gun. Civilian mechanics didn't typically think in terms of deployments. They thought in terms of road trips, daily commutes, and weekend adventures. Phillips leaned against the vehicle's fender, his posture deceptively casual. "You seem to know a lot about military vehicle maintenance for someone who works in a civilian garage. Like I said, I read, what unit were you with?" The question came from Turner, direct and without preamble. The question hit Tasha like a physical blow. For 15 years, no one had asked about her military service because no one suspected she'd had any. She'd been careful to never mention it, never reference it, never give any indication that she'd served. Her carefully constructed civilian identity was crumbling, and she could feel the eyes of her coworkers on her, their surprise and confusion palpable. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded hollow. Lawson stepped closer, his presence commanding despite his respectful tone. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your knowledge of military vehicle systems, your assessment methodology, your terminology, it all points to hands-on experience, and not just any experience." You're thinking like someone who's worked on these vehicles. In operational environments. Eddie finally found his voice. Tasha, what are they talking about? You never mentioned serving in the military. The moment stretched out, filled with the distant sound of traffic on the highway and the mechanical hum of the garage's air compressor. Tasha looked at the faces surrounding her, Eddie's confusion, her co-workers' curiosity, and the soldiers' growing certainty that they'd stumbled onto something significant. It was a long time ago, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. What branch? Phillips asked, his tone gentler now, as if he sensed they were approaching something. Fragile, Army, MOS? Turner's question was automatic military occupational specialty, was one of the first things soldiers asked each other. Motor transport operator, 88M. The numbers came out mechanically, part of an identity she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it never existed. But even as she said it, Tasha knew it wasn't the whole truth. An 88M might know basic vehicle maintenance, but they wouldn't have the depth of knowledge she'd just displayed. They certainly wouldn't think in terms of operational stress and combat environments. Lawson studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in details that others might miss. The way she held herself, the automatic scan of her surroundings, the precise, economical movements that spoke of training that went beyond civilian mechanic school. Motor transport, he repeated thoughtfully. That's interesting. Because the way you approached this vehicle, the things you noticed first, the potential problems you identified, that's not 88 meters knowledge. That's more like what I'd expect from someone with extensive experience maintaining vehicles in forward operating bases. Someone who understood that when things break downrange, people die. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Tasha felt her carefully maintained composure. Crack, just slightly, but enough for these trained observers to notice. Ma'am, Lawson continued, his voice now carrying the tone of someone who'd found a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit where it was supposed to go. I've been in Special Forces for 22 years. I've worked with motor transport, logistics, and maintenance personnel all over the world. What you just did, that level of diagnostic expertise combined with operational awareness, that doesn't come from driving trucks. Logan stepped forward, his young face creased with confusion and concern. Tasha, I don't understand. You've been here 15 years. You never talked about the military. Because I didn't want to talk about it, she replied, more sharply than she intended. The sharpness in her voice carried an edge that made the soldiers exchange meaningful glances. It was the tone of someone who'd seen things they'd rather forget, experienced things they didn't want to discuss. Turner, despite his youth, had enough experience to recognize the signs. Ma'am, how long were you in? 8 years? Deployments? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Tasha looked at the 3 Green Berets, seeing in their faces the same expression she'd once worn herself, the look of soldiers who'd been places and done things that civilians couldn't understand. 3, she said finally. Where? Iraq, Afghanistan. The words came out like they were being pulled from her against her will. Phillips nodded slowly. What years? 2001 to 2009. The dates meant something to these men. They'd served during the same period, in the same places, during some of the most intense fighting of the conflicts. The look that passed between them was one of recognition and growing respect. Ma'am, Lawson said quietly, 2001 to 2009, 3 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. That puts you in the thick of some serious operations. And your knowledge of vehicle maintenance, your understanding of operational requirements, I'm starting to think there's more to your story than motor transport. Tasha felt the walls she'd built around her past beginning to crumble. These men were too experienced, too perceptive, and too persistent to be satisfied with half-truths and evasions. They knew she was hiding something, and they weren't going to let it go. The tension in the parking lot was thick enough to cut with a knife. Tasha could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the mountain breeze, and it had nothing to do with the Wyoming heat. Command Sergeant Major Lawson's gray eyes never left, her face studying her with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades reading people in life-or-death situations. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your service record." "Why?" The question came out more defensively than Tasha intended. "I did my time, got out, moved on. That's what a lot of veterans do." "Staff." Sergeant Phillips straightened from where he'd been leaning against the Humvey. "Most veterans don't disappear into small-town garages and pretend they never served. Most veterans don't have the kind of advanced technical knowledge you just displayed." Eddie Kowalski stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern and confusion. "Tasha, in 15 years, you never once mentioned being in the Army." "Not once. We've had veterans come through here before, and they always mention it somehow." Logan Hayes nodded agreement. "When Jerry Patterson worked here, he had Army stickers on his toolbox. When Mike Hendricks helped out last summer, he wore his Marine Corps t-shirts. But you nothing. It's like you were trying to hide it." "Maybe because I was," Tasha snapped, then immediately regretted the admission. The words hung in the air like a confession, and she watched as the 3 Green Berets processed this information. Sergeant First Class Turner, despite his youth, had the expression of someone putting pieces together in his mind. "Ma'am," Turner said carefully, "soldiers don't usually hide their service unless something went wrong. Either something bad happened to them, or they did something they're not proud of. Or," Lawson added quietly, "they were involved in operations that required them to maintain a low profile afterward." The suggestion hit Tasha like a physical blow. These men were thinking in terms of classified operations, special programs. The kind of military work that came with non-disclosure agreements and security clearances that lasted long after discharge. "I wasn't involved in anything classified," she said quickly. Too quickly. Phillips raised an eyebrow. "Nobody said you were. But your reaction is interesting." Tony Gutierrez, who'd been quietly observing from the garage bay, finally spoke up. "Tasha, these guys seem to think you're more than just a regular soldier. What aren't you telling us?" The question came from a friend, someone she'd worked alongside for years, and it carried a weight that the soldier's interrogation couldn't match. Tony had 3 kids, a mortgage, and the kind of straightforward honesty that made deception feel like betrayal. "It's complicated," Tasha said, her voice barely audible. "Uncomplicated," Lawson said, though not unkindly. "Ma'am, your knowledge of military vehicle systems suggests extensive hands-on experience in operational environments. Your diagnostic approach indicates training beyond standard motor transport. And your reaction to our questions suggests you're carrying something heavy from your service." He paused, studying her carefully. "Now we can do this the easy way, with you telling us what we're dealing with, or we can do it the hard way, where we start making phone calls to people who have access to personnel records." The threat was delivered professionally, but it was still a threat. Tasha felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, the same feeling she'd experienced during her final months in the Army when everything had started falling apart. "You don't understand," she said, her voice stronger now, edged with something that might have been desperation. "Some things are better left buried, are they?" Turner asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been burying yourself along with whatever happened." The observation was perceptive and painful in its accuracy. For 15 years, Tasha had been living a half-life, using her civilian identity as a shield against memories she couldn't face in the past. She couldn't reconcile with the person she'd tried to become, Caleb Fisher, who'd been silently working nearby, set down his tools and approached the group. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but Tasha's been a good friend and a hell of a mechanic for as long as I've known her. If she doesn't want to talk about her military service, maybe we should respect that." "I appreciate the loyalty," Lawson said, But this isn't about respect. It's about security. Security? Eddie's voice rose. What kind of security? She fixes cars, for crying out loud. She fixes cars now, Phillips corrected. But her knowledge base suggests she used to do a lot more than that. And in our line of work, when we encounter someone with unexplained expertise and a hidden military background, we investigate. Logan stepped protectively closer to Tasha, his young face flushed. With anger, this is harassment. She doesn't have to answer your questions. Actually, Turner said quietly, depending on her security clearance level and the nature of her previous assignments, she might. The words sent a chill through Tasha that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Security clearances didn't expire, they went inactive. And certain types of military service came with obligations that lasted long after discharge papers were signed. I don't have an active clearance, she said quickly. Nobody said you did, Lawson replied. But clearances can be reactivated. And certain types of knowledge, once possessed, create ongoing responsibilities. The conversation was moving into territory that Tasha had spent 15 years trying to avoid. She looked around at her co-workers, good, honest people who thought they knew her, who had no idea that the woman they'd worked beside for a decade and a half had once been someone entirely different. Ma'am, Philip said, his tone gentler. Now look, we're not the enemy here. We're soldiers, just like you were. We understand that some service comes with costs that civilians can't comprehend. But your knowledge, your skills, they're too valuable to waste in hiding. Maybe I don't want to be valuable, Tasha replied. Maybe I just want to be left alone. Want to be left alone, or need to be left alone? Turner asked. Because there's a difference. The question cut straight to the heart of everything Tasha had been running from. She'd told herself for years that she chose this life, this anonymity, this deliberate underachievement. But the truth was more complicated and more painful than she'd ever admitted, even to herself. Both, she said finally, the admission feeling like defeat. Lawson studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Ma'am, I'm going to make a phone call, just to verify some information. Would you prefer to have this conversation privately? Or are you comfortable with your colleagues hearing whatever we discuss? The question was a crossroads. Tasha could feel the weight of 15 years of carefully constructed lies pressing down on her. Her co-workers were looking at her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. These men who'd become the closest thing to family she'd allowed herself since leaving the army. Eddie stepped forward, his voice gruff with emotion. Tasha, whatever it is, whatever happened, it doesn't change anything here. Your family, we take care of family. The words were meant to be comforting, but they only made the deception feel heavier. These people thought they knew her, but they knew only the version of herself she'd created, a simplified, sanitized version that bore little resemblance to the soldier she'd once been. You might feel differently when you know the truth, she sighed quietly. Try us, Tony said simply. Lawson pulled out his phone, then paused. Ma'am, last chance to control this narrative. You can tell us what we need to know, or I can find out through official channels. But either way, this conversation is happening. Tasha looked at the faces surrounding her co-workers, her friends, the only stability she'd known since leaving the military. In a few minutes, everything would change. The careful anonymity she'd built would be shattered, and there would be no going back. What do you want to know? She asked, her voice resigned. Let's start with your real Mose, Lawson said. Because we both know it was an 88 meters motor transport. The moment of truth had arrived, and Tasha felt the last of her defenses crumbling away. The silence stretched across the parking lot like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on Highway 287. Tasha Burke stared at the three Green Berets, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would shatter 15 years of carefully constructed anonymity. Her hands, steady enough to thread a needle or adjust a carburetor, trembled slightly as she wiped them on her coveralls. "My real Elmios was 91B, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Vehicle mechanic, but that's not the whole story." "Command." Sergeant Major Lawson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Go on." Tasha looked around at her co-workers, Eddie with his concerned frown, Logan with his protective stance, Tony and Caleb watching with growing confusion. These men had become her anchor to normalcy, her proof that she could be someone other than the soldier she'd once been. "I was attached to special operations units," she continued, each word feeling like it was being pulled from her against her will. "Mainly special forces teams. My job was to keep their vehicles running in places where calling for a tow truck wasn't an option." Staff Sergeant Phillips straightened, his casual demeanor replaced by sharp attention. "Which groups?" "5th and 7th Special Forces groups. 3 deployments between 2003 and 2008. The numbers came out mechanically, part of a service record she'd spent years trying to forget. "That explains the expertise," Sergeant First Class Turner said quietly. "Working with SF units, you'd have seen every kind of vehicle modification, every type of battlefield repair scenario." Eddie stepped forward, his weathered face creased with confusion. "Tasha, I still don't understand. Why hide this?" "Being a military mechanic, especially one who worked with special forces, that's something to be proud of." "Is it?" The question came out sharper than Tasha intended, edged with years of suppressed pain and guilt. "Is it something to be proud of when you survive and others don't?" The words hung in the air like a confession, and Lawson's expression softened slightly. He'd heard that tone before, seen that look in the eyes of soldiers carrying survivors' guilt and the weight of memories they couldn't escape. "Ma'am," he said gently, "what happened over there?" Tasha felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. For 15 years, she'd managed to keep these memories locked away, buried beneath the routine of oil changes and brake repairs. But now, faced with soldiers who understood the language of combat and sacrifice, the barriers were crumbling. "Kandahar, Province, 2008, she began, her voice taking on the flat, emotionless tone that veterans sometimes used when discussing trauma. "I was attached to an A-team running reconnaissance missions along the Pakistani border. 12-man team plus me, I was the only woman, the only support personnel." Logan moved closer, his young face filled with concern he didn't fully understand. "Tasha, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "Because they're going to find out anyway, and I'd rather you hear it from me." She turned back to Lawson, meeting his gray eyes with something that might have been defiance. "We were operating out of a forward operating base that was basically a collection of tents and sandbags. My job was to keep their vehicles mission ready, no matter what. Humveys, MRAPs, dirt bikes, anything that had an engine and could get the team where they needed to go." Phillips nodded. "Tough assignment." Forward operating bases, especially the small ones, didn't have much in the way of spare parts or backup equipment. "That's why they needed someone who could improvise," Tasha continued. "Someone who could rebuild a transmission using parts from 3 different vehicles or jury-rig a cooling system using materials from a destroyed Afghan truck." She paused, her hands unconsciously clenching into fists. "I was good at it. Maybe too good." The team started taking risks they wouldn't have taken with a less capable mechanic. They knew that no matter what happened to their vehicles, I could get them running again. Turner, despite his youth, had enough experience to see where this story was heading. "Ma'am, what happened to the team?" The question hit Tasha like a physical blow. She'd managed to avoid answering it for 15 years, even to herself. But now, surrounded by soldiers who would understand the weight of what she was about to say, she found she couldn't hide anymore. "IED," she said simply. "Improvised explosive device." They were returning from a mission, convoy of 3 vehicles. I wasn't with them. I was back at the FOB, working on a backup Humvey that had thrown a rod. Her voice began to crack, the professional detachment finally giving way to raw emotion. The lead vehicle hit a buried artillery shell rigged with a pressure plate. The explosion flipped the Humvey, killed the driver and the team leader instantly. The other two vehicles stopped to provide aid and extract casualties. Eddie's face had gone pale. Tony and Caleb exchanged glances, beginning to understand that they were hearing about something far beyond their civilian comprehension. That's when the secondary IEDs detonated, Tasha continued, her voice now barely audible. The insurgents had planned for the rescue attempt. They knew our procedures, knew we'd stop to help our wounded. Lawson's expression was grim. He'd seen similar scenarios, understood the tactical sophistication that had made the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan so devastating to American forces. How many? He asked quietly. All of them. The words came out like a death sentence. 12 Green Berets dead. The men who'd trusted me to keep their vehicles running, who'd relied on my expertise to get them home safely, gone. The parking lot fell completely silent. Even the distant traffic seemed to fade away, leaving only the weight of tragedy and the sound of Tasha's labored breathing. "Ma'am," Philip said softly, "that wasn't your fault. You weren't even in the convoy." "Wasn't I?" Tasha's voice was raw with years of suppressed guilt. "I was the one who'd taught them they could trust. Their equipment, absolutely. I was the one who'd made their vehicles so reliable that they never hesitated to go deeper into hostile territory, to take on missions that other teams might have declined." She looked around at her co-workers, seeing the shock and sympathy in their faces. "I was the one who survived while they didn't. I was supposed to be there, supposed to be in that convoy, but I stayed behind to fix a fucking engine." Logan stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Tasha, you can't blame yourself for surviving, can't I?" She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "For 15 years I'd been asking myself the same question. If I'd been in that convoy, if I'd been there to spot potential problems with the vehicles, to notice something the drivers missed, would they still be alive?" Turner shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, that's not how IEDs work. Your presence wouldn't have changed anything except to add your name to the casualty list." "Maybe that's what should have happened," Tasha replied quietly. The admission hung in the air like a smoking gun, revealing the depth of survivor's guilt that had driven her into hiding for a decade and a half. She'd buried herself in this small-town garage not just to escape the memories, but because part of her believed she didn't deserve the life her teammates had been denied. Lawson studied her for a long moment, his expression mixing professional assessment with human compassion. "Ma'am, is that why you left the Army? Is that why you've been hiding out here?" "I didn't leave," Tasha said, her voice bitter. "I was medically retired. PTSD, survivor's guilt, depression. The Army decided I was no longer fit for duty." "And you believed them?" Phillips asked. "I knew they were right," she replied. "After Kandahar, I couldn't trust my own judgment. Every time I worked on a vehicle, I saw their faces. Every time someone relied on my expertise, I wondered if I was sending them to their deaths." The revelation was complete now, her secret finally exposed to the harsh light of day. Tasha felt strangely empty, as if the confession had drained something vital from her. For 15 years, she'd carried this burden alone, and now it was shared with strangers who happened to wear the same uniform her dead teammates had worn. "Ma'am," Lawson said quietly, "I think we need to talk about what happens next." The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the parking lot of Valley View Auto Service. Tasha Burke stood among the wreckage of her carefully constructed anonymity, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since those dark months after Kandahar. The 3 Green Berets watched her with expressions that mixed professional interest with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "What happens next is nothing," Tasha said, her voice steadying as she tried to regain some measure of control. "I told you what you wanted to know. Now you can drive your Humvee out of here and forget you ever met me." Command Sergeant Major Lawson shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. Your service record, your expertise, the circumstances of your retirement, this isn't something we can just walk away from." "Why not?" Logan Hayes stepped forward, his young face flushed with protective anger. "She's been working here peacefully for 15 years. She's not hurting anyone. Why can't you just leave her alone?" Staff Sergeant Phillips looked at Logan with something approaching sympathy. "Son, it's not that simple." "Sergeant Burke, it's just Tasha," she interrupted sharply. "I'm not Sergeant anything anymore." "Tasha then," Phillips continued patiently. "You have knowledge and experience that's incredibly valuable to current operations. The techniques you developed working with Special Forces, the field modifications you pioneered, that information could save lives." Eddie Kowalski stepped closer to Tasha, his weathered face creased with concern. "Valuable how?" "She fixes cars in a garage in Wyoming. What's valuable about that?" Sergeant First Class Turner looked around the group, then focused on Eddie. "Sir, what she did wasn't just fixing cars. She was keeping Special Forces teams operational in some of the most hostile environments on Earth, using improvised solutions and field modifications that most mechanics wouldn't even attempt." "That was 15 years ago," Tasha said quietly. "Technology's changed. Equipment's different. Whatever I knew then is obsolete now, is it?" Lawson asked, pulling out his phone and scrolling through something. "Because according to the preliminary assessment I just received, some of the field modifications attributed to your work are still being used by special operations units today. Your improvised cooling system design was adopted as standard procedure for desert operations." The words hit Tasha like a physical blow. She'd spent 15 years trying to forget her military service, trying to convince herself that her work had died with her team in Kandahar. Learning that her innovations were still saving lives was both vindicating and devastating. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely audible. "There's a lot you don't know," Phillips said gently. "After Kandahar, after what happened to ODA 527, the Army conducted an extensive investigation. They wanted to understand how a single-eyed attack could be so devastating to such an experienced team." Tony Gutierrez, who'd been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "What did they find?" Turner answered. "They found that it wasn't a single attack. It was a coordinated ambush that had been planned for weeks. The insurgents had been watching the team's patterns, studying their routes, timing, their movements. What happened wasn't the result of overconfidence or mechanical failure. It was the result of sophisticated enemy intelligence and careful planning." "You're saying it wasn't her fault?" Caleb Fisher asked. "We're saying it was never her fault," Lawson replied firmly, looking directly at Tasha. "Ma'am, the investigation concluded that ODA 527 was targeted specifically because of their success rate. They've been too effective, disrupted too many enemy operations. The attack wasn't random, it was an assassination." Tasha felt her knees weaken. For 15 years, she'd carried the weight of believing her expertise had gotten her teammates killed. The idea that they'd been deliberately targeted, that no amount of mechanical knowledge could have saved them, was almost too much to process. "That can't be right," she whispered. "If they'd known it was an ambush, someone would have told me. Someone would have explained, would they?" Phillips asked quietly. "You were medically retired with severe PTSD. The doctors felt that additional information about the attack might worsen your condition. They thought it was better to let you heal without the burden of operational details." "Heal?" Tasha's voice rose, anger finally breaking through the shock. "I've spent 15 years thinking I killed my friends. How is that healing?" The parking lot fell silent, except for the distant sound of wind through the pines. Eddie put a protective hand on Tasha's shoulder, his gesture simple but profoundly supportive. "Ma'am," Lawson said carefully, "the classification on the Kandahar investigation was recently lifted. The information is now available to family members and surviving team members. You have the right to see the complete report." "I don't want to see it," Tasha said immediately. I can't go through that again." "You don't have to," Turner assured her. "But you should know that your teammates' families have been asking about you. They want to meet the person who kept their sons and husbands alive for 3 deployments. The words hit Tasha harder than any physical blow could have. She'd avoided contact with the families, convinced that seeing her would only remind them of their loss. The idea that they actually wanted to meet her, that they might not blame her for surviving, was almost incomprehensible. "They don't hate me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Hate you?" Phillips looked genuinely surprised. "Ma'am, they consider you part of their family. You were the 13th member of that team, the person who made sure their loved ones came home safely from dozens of missions. They've been looking for you for years." Logan moved closer to Tasha, his young face filled with an emotion he didn't fully understand. "Tasha, these people, they've been wanting to thank you?" "According to their letters to the Army Personnel Center, yes," Lawson confirmed. "They want to express their gratitude for the role you played in keeping their family members alive for as long as possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Tasha sank onto the bumper of the Humvey, overwhelmed by the collision between the guilt she'd carried for 15 years and the reality she was only now learning. "I don't understand any of this. If the investigation cleared me, if the families don't blame me, why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because you disappeared," Turner said simply. "After your medical retirement, you changed your name, moved to Wyoming, and went completely off the grid. The Army tried to maintain contact, but you'd made it clear you wanted nothing to do with your military service." "I changed my name from Natasha to Tasha," she said defensively. "That's hardly disappearing." "You also changed your Social Security number, had your medical records sealed, and declined all veteran benefits," Phillips pointed out. "For all practical purposes, Sergeant Natasha Burke ceased to exist in 2009. Eddie looked at Tasha with new understanding. "That's why you never talked about the military. That's why you never used VA benefits or joined the VFW. You were trying to erase that part of your life." "I was trying to survive," Tasha replied quietly. "Every time someone thanked me for my service, every time I saw a uniform or heard about casualties overseas, it felt like I was betraying the memory of my team. How could I accept gratitude for service that got my friends killed? Because that service didn't get them killed," Lawson said firmly. "Enemy action got them killed. Your service kept them alive through 3 deployments and dozens of missions. The fact that they eventually encountered an enemy who was smarter and more determined than they were doesn't diminish what you accomplished." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot. A black SUV with government plates came to a stop near the garage, and 2 people in business attire emerged. Even from a distance, their bearing and manner suggested federal agents. "Expecting company?" Phillips asked Lawson quietly. "Not from me," the command sergeant major replied, but his expression suggested he had a good idea who they were. As the 2 agents approached, Tasha felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. For 15 years, she'd managed to avoid official attention. Now, in the span of a few hours, her carefully constructed anonymity had attracted the interest of both special forces and what appeared to be federal investigators. "Sergeant Burke?" The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and intelligent eyes, addressed Tasha directly. "I'm Agent Sarah Mitchell, Defense Criminal Investigative Service." "This is Agent David Park. We need to speak with you about your military service record." The web was tightening around Tasha's secret life, and she was beginning to realize that her quiet existence in Harmony Springs was about to become much more complicated. Agent Sarah Mitchell approached with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions and getting truthful answers. Her partner, Agent David Park, hung back slightly, his dark eyes scanning the group with the systematic attention of a trained investigator. The arrival of federal agents transformed what had been a tense but manageable situation into something far more serious. "Sergeant Burke," Agent Mitchell said, her voice professional but not unfriendly, "we understand you've been having a conversation with these Special Forces personnel about your military service." Tasha stood slowly from the Humvey's bumper, her body language shifting into something more guarded. "I'm not Sergeant Burke anymore. I was medically retired 15 years ago." "We're aware of your retirement status," Agent Park said, stepping forward. "What we're interested in is the period immediately before your retirement. Specifically, the events in Kandahar province in 2008. Command Sergeant Major Lawson moved protectively closer to Tasha. "Agents, with all due respect, this woman has been through enough today. She's already provided information about her service record voluntarily, and we appreciate her cooperation," Mitchell replied smoothly. "However, new information has come to light regarding the attack on Operational Detachment Alpha 527 information. That requires follow-up investigation." Eddie Kowalski stepped forward, his weathered face flushed with protective anger. "Now hold on just a minute. Tasha's been working for me for 15 years. She's never done anything wrong, never caused any trouble. What kind of investigation are you talking about?" Agent Park consulted a tablet he'd pulled from his briefcase. "Mr. Kowalski, we're not suggesting that Ms. Burke has done anything wrong. However, recent intelligence developments have raised questions about the circumstances surrounding the attack that killed her team." "What kind of questions?" Staff Sergeant Phillips asked, his tone carrying the wariness of a soldier who dealt with federal investigators before. Mitchell looked around the group, her expression suggesting she was making a calculation about how much information to share. 3 weeks ago, we captured a high-value target in Afghanistan. During interrogation, he provided detailed information about insurgent operations from 2008, including specific references to the attack on ODA 527. Tasha felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of references?" "The kind that suggest the attack was more sophisticated than we initially understood," Park replied. "According to our source, the insurgents had detailed intelligence about your team's operations, including their vehicle, maintenance schedules, and the identity of their support personnel." The implications hit Tasha like a physical blow. "They knew about me. They knew about you," Mitchell confirmed. "More specifically, they knew that eliminating you would significantly degrade the team's operational capability. The attack was planned as a 2-phase operation: eliminate the mechanic first, then ambush the team when their vehicles inevitably failed." Logan Hayes looked confused. But Tasha wasn't in the convoy. She stayed behind to work on another vehicle. "Which is why the plan failed," Park explained. "The insurgents expected her to be with the team. When she wasn't, they proceeded with Phase 2 of their plan, the ambush, but without the mechanical failures they'd been counting on to maximize casualties." Sergeant First Class Turner straightened, his expression grim. "You're saying the attack was specifically designed to target her?" "We're saying the attack was designed to eliminate the team's most valuable asset," Mitchell replied. "Sergeant Burke's expertise in field maintenance and vehicle modification had made ODA 527 one of the most effective units in the theater. The insurgents recognized that eliminating her would cripple the team's ability to operate in remote areas. The revelation was staggering in its implications. For 15 years, Tasha had believed she'd failed her team by not being present during the attack. Now she was learning that her absence had actually prevented an even more devastating outcome. "Ma'am," Lawson said quietly, "if you'd been in that convoy, the insurgents would have achieved their primary objective. Your team would have been stranded in hostile territory with disabled vehicles and no way to effect repairs." Tasha sank back onto the Humvee's bumper, overwhelmed by the collision between her guilt-ridden assumptions and the complex reality of asymmetric warfare. "So they died because I was too valuable to lose?" "They died because they were soldiers fighting a determined enemy," Phillips corrected gently. "But your survival meant that their sacrifice wasn't compounded by the complete destruction of their unit's capability." Agent Mitchell consulted her tablet. "Sergeant Burke, the intelligence we've gathered suggests that your innovations in field maintenance were considered a significant threat by insurgent leadership. They specifically targeted teams that had access to your expertise." "How many other teams?" Tasha asked, her voice barely audible. 3 other Special Forces units reported unusual mechanical failures followed by ambush during the same time. "Period," Park replied. "In each case, the teams had recently received technical support from personnel trained in your methods." The scope of the revelation was devastating. Tasha's expertise hadn't just made her own team a target, it had painted a bullseye on every unit that benefited from her innovations. Tony Gutierrez, who'd been listening with growing horror, finally spoke. "Jesus Christ, Tasha, they were hunting you specifically?" "They were hunting the capability she represented," Mitchell corrected. "In asymmetric warfare, eliminating key technical personnel can be more effective than destroying equipment. Equipment can be replaced, specialized knowledge and experience cannot." Caleb Fisher looked around the group with confusion. "I still don't understand what this has to do with a federal investigation. This all happened 15 years ago." Agent Park's expression grew more serious. "Mr. Fisher, the insurgent we captured also provided information about current operations. Specifically, he indicated that similar targeting strategies are being employed against American technical personnel in current conflict zones." "You think this is still happening?" Eddie asked. "We know it's still happening," Mitchell replied. "Which is why we need Sergeant Burke's help in understanding the methods and motivations behind these targeting strategies." Tasha looked up at the federal agents, seeing in their faces the same expression she'd encountered countless times during her military service, the look of people who needed her expertise to solve problems that couldn't be solved any other way. "What kind of help?" she asked reluctantly. "We need you to review the intelligence we've gathered," Park explained. "Help us understand how insurgents identify high-value technical targets and develop countermeasures to protect current personnel." "Told you, I don't do that anymore," Tasha said firmly. "I fix civilian cars in a civilian garage. I don't have security clearance, I don't have access to classified information, and I don't want to be involved in military operations." "Ma'am," Lawson interjected, "with respect, you're already involved. Your innovations are still being used by special operations units worldwide. The techniques you developed are literally keeping soldiers alive right now. And the targeting strategies developed to counter your work are literally getting soldiers killed right now," Mitchell added. Bluntly, the weight of moral obligation settled on Tasha's shoulders like a familiar burden. For 15 years, she'd managed to convince herself that her military service was behind her, that she could live a quiet civilian life without consequences. But the war had a way of following soldiers home, of demanding continued service even from those who'd given everything they thought they had to give. "If I help you," she said slowly, "what exactly would that involve?" "Initially just consultation," Park replied. "Review intelligence reports, provide technical analysis, help us understand the enemy's perspective on American maintenance capabilities. And eventually?" Mitchell and Park exchanged glances. "Eventually, we might need you to help develop training programs for current technical personnel." Teach them how to recognize when they're being targeted and how to protect themselves and their units. The request was reasonable, patriotic, and utterly terrifying. It would mean re-entering the world she'd fled, acknowledging expertise she'd tried to bury, and accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond her. Small-town garage. "I need time to think about this," Tasha said finally. "Of course," Mitchell replied. "But ma'am, time is a luxury we don't have much of. Every day we delay developing countermeasures is another day that American soldiers are at risk." As the federal agents prepared to leave, promising to return the next day for her answer, Tasha looked around at her co-workers, the men who'd become her anchor to civilian life. Their faces reflected confusion, concern, and something that might have been pride in learning that their quiet colleague had once been someone of crucial importance to national security. The question now wasn't whether she was qualified to help, it was whether she was strong enough to bear the weight of that responsibility again. That evening, Tasha sat alone in her small apartment above Henderson's hardware store, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The cramped living space reflected her 15 years of deliberate minimalism, a few pieces of functional furniture, no photographs, no mementos, nothing that connected her to the life she'd left behind. The only personal items were her father's tools, carefully maintained and stored in a corner, cabinet she rarely opened. The silence was deafening after the chaos of the afternoon. Her phone had been ringing constantly, reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the federal agent's visit, curiosity seekers from town, and 3 separate calls from numbers she didn't recognize but suspected were military-related. She'd stopped answering after the first few. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Through the peephole, she saw Eddie Kowalski standing in the hallway, holding a covered plate and wearing an expression of determined concern. "I know you're in there, Tasha," he called quietly. "My wife sent dinner. Says you probably haven't eaten since this morning." She opened the door reluctantly, accepting the plate with a grateful nod. "Thanks, Eddie. Tell Martha I appreciate it." "Tell her yourself," Eddie said, pushing past her into the apartment. "I'm not leaving until we talk about what happened today." Tasha set the plate on her small kitchen table and gestured toward the couch. "What's to talk about?" "Some federal agents want me to consult on military matters. I haven't decided what to do." Eddie studied her with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd spent 40 years reading people and situations. "Bullshit. You're scared out of your mind, and you're looking for reasons to say no." The blunt assessment stung because it was accurate. "Maybe I have good reasons to be scared. Maybe you do," Eddie agreed. "But that doesn't mean those federal agents are wrong about needing your help." Tasha moved to the window, looking down at Main Street, where the occasional car passed under the streetlights. Harmony Springs looked exactly as it had when she'd first arrived 15 years ago, quiet, predictable, safe. It was everything she'd needed after the chaos of combat and the devastation of loss. "Eddie, you don't understand what they're asking," she said without turning around. "It's not just consultation. It's stepping back into a world that nearly destroyed me once already. And if you don't step back into it, how many other people might get destroyed?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge. Eddie had a way of cutting through complexity to reach the essential moral core of any situation. "It's not that simple," Tasha protested. "I'm not the same person I was 15 years ago. I don't have the skills, the clearances, the connections." "You have the knowledge," Eddie interrupted. "That Agent Mitchell made it pretty clear that your knowledge is what they need, not your connections or clearances." Tasha turned from the window, her expression mixing frustration with fear. "What if I'm wrong? What if my advice gets people killed instead of saving them?" "What if your silence gets people killed?" Eddie countered. "Those agents seem to think." That was already happening. Before Tasha could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Logan Hayes, his young face creased with concern and determination. "Logan, what are you doing here?" Tasha asked. "I've been thinking about what those soldiers said today," he replied, stepping into the apartment without invitation. "About your team, about what happened to them. I need to ask you something." Tasha felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. "What? Do you think they'd want you to hide for the rest of your life?" Logan's question was direct and painful in its simplicity. "Do you think they'd want you to let other soldiers die because you were too afraid to help?" The words hit Tasha like a physical blow. She'd spent 15 years trying not to think about what her dead teammates would want, focusing instead on managing her own guilt and trauma. "They're dead, Logan," she said quietly. "They don't want anything." "That's not true, and you know it," Logan replied with surprising maturity. "I never served, but I know what honor means. I know what duty means. And I know that the woman who spent 3 deployments keeping those men alive wouldn't walk away from the chance to save other soldiers just because she was scared." Eddie nodded approvingly. "The boy's got a point." "I'm not that woman anymore," Tasha said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded hollow. "Aren't you?" Logan asked. "Because today, when those Green Berets were dismissing you, when they assumed you didn't know anything about their vehicle, you could have stayed quiet. You could have let them leave with a problem that might have gotten them killed somewhere down the road. But you didn't. You spoke up. You used your knowledge to help them, even though it meant exposing your secret." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Tasha had revealed her expertise not because she wanted attention or recognition, but because she couldn't stand the thought of precision machinery suffering due to ignorance, or the soldiers who depended on that machinery suffering as a result. "That's different," she protested weakly. "Is it?" Eddie asked. "Seems to me like the same instinct that kept your Special Forces team alive for 3 deployments. The same instinct that made you too valuable for the enemy to ignore." Another knock interrupted the conversation, this one more authoritative. Through the peephole, Tasha saw Command Sergeant Major Lawson standing in the hallway, still in his civilian clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. She opened the door reluctantly. "Sergeant Major, I wasn't expecting you." "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion," Lawson said formally. "But I felt it was important to speak with you before you make your decision about the federal agent's request." "What about?" Tasha asked, though she suspected she already knew. "About the men who are currently serving in the units that use your innovations," Lawson replied. "The soldiers who are alive today because of the techniques you developed 15 years ago." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph, a group of young soldiers standing beside a modified Humvey in what appeared to be a Middle Eastern setting. They looked impossibly young, their faces mixing confidence with the nervous energy of people heading into danger. "This is Bravo Team, 2nd Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group," Lawson explained. "They're currently deployed in Syria, running reconnaissance missions along the Turkish border. Their vehicles are maintained using protocols you developed. Their field repair techniques were adapted from your innovations." Tasha studied the photograph, seeing in these young faces echoes of the men she'd served with and lost. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because 3 days ago, Bravo Team's vehicle broke down in hostile territory," Lawson continued. "They were 60 kilometers from the nearest friendly forces, surrounded by insurgents who were actively hunting for them. Using the field repair techniques you pioneered, they managed to get their vehicle running and extract safely." He swiped to another photograph, this one showing the same soldiers back at their base, tired but alive. "All 8 men made it home. Because you taught someone how to rebuild a transmission using improvised parts." The weight of the revelation settled on Tasha's shoulders like a familiar burden. Her innovations weren't just historical curiosities, they were actively saving lives in current operations. "Sergeant Major," she said quietly, "what exactly are you asking me to do?" I'm asking you to remember who you were before Kandahar, Lawson replied. I'm asking you to remember that your knowledge and expertise are gifts that can save lives. And I'm asking you to consider that, maybe, your teammates didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life hiding in a garage. The room fell. Silent except for the sound of traffic on Main Street and the distant whistle of a freight train passing through town. Tasha looked around at the faces surrounding her Eddie with his paternal concern, Logan with his earnest idealism, and Lawson with his professional compassion. If I do this, she said finally, if I help them, there's no going back to the way things were. My quiet life here, my anonymity, all of that disappears. Maybe, Lawson agreed. But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Tasha moved back to the window, looking out at the town that had sheltered her for 15 years. Tomorrow she would have to give the federal agents an answer that would determine not just her own future, but potentially the lives of soldiers she'd never met. For the first time in 15 years, she found herself thinking not about what she'd lost, but about what she might still be able to save. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, with low clouds hanging over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Tasha arrived at Valley View Auto Service early, hoping to find some normalcy in the familiar routine of work. Instead, she found a small crowd gathered in the parking lot, reporters with cameras, curiosity seekers from town, and what appeared to be several veterans in civilian clothes who'd driven up from Colorado Springs. Tasha, a young woman with a press badge, thrust a microphone toward her as she tried to reach the garage door. Is it true that you were a decorated Special Forces mechanic? Can you comment on reports that the federal government is trying to recruit you back into service? She pushed through the crowd without responding, but the questions followed her like a swarm of persistent insects. Inside the garage, she found her coworkers already at work, their faces mixing concern with something that looked like protective defiance. Morning, Tony Gutierrez called out, his tone deliberately casual. Figured you might want to use the back entrance from now on. Thanks, Tasha replied, pulling on her coveralls with hands that trembled slightly. Any word from the federal agents? They called 20 minutes ago, Eddie said from his office doorway. They'll be here at 10 o'clock for your answer. Caleb Fisher looked up from the engine he was working on. You know, if you decide to do this federal thing, we'll understand. Won't like it, but we'll understand. Do what? Tasha asked, though. She knew what he meant. Help them, Logan said simply. Use your knowledge to save soldiers. It's what you should do, and we all know it. The support from her co-workers was both touching and terrifying. For 15 years, these men had been her anchor to civilian life, proof that she could exist as someone other than the soldier she'd once been. Now they were encouraging her to embrace the very identity she'd been running from. At exactly 10 o'clock, the black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Agents Mitchell and Park emerged, followed by Command Sergeant Major Lawson and two people Tasha didn't recognize: an older woman in military dress uniform and a man in expensive suit who carried himself with the authority of high-level government. Service. Sergeant Burke, Agent Mitchell said as the group entered the garage. I'd like you to meet Colonel Patricia Hayes, Army Materiel Command, and Dr. James Brennan from the Department of Defense. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her bearing reflecting decades of military service. Sergeant Burke, I've reviewed your service record and the innovations attributed to your work. I want you to know that techniques you developed are currently being used by special operations units in 12 different countries. With respect, ma'am, Tasha replied. I'm not Sergeant Burke anymore. I haven't been for 15 years. Dr. Brennan consulted a tablet he carried. Ms. Burke, then. We understand your reluctance to re-engage with military service, but we need you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. He showed her the tablet screen, which displayed a map dotted with red markers. These represent locations where American technical personnel have been specifically targeted in the past 18 months. The pattern suggests a coordinated effort to eliminate our most capable field maintenance specialists. Tasha studied the map, seeing patterns that spoke to her from years of operational experience. They're targeting logistics nodes, places where technical expertise is concentrated. Exactly, Colonel Hayes confirmed. The enemy has learned that eliminating key technical personnel can be more effective than destroying the equipment. They're using the same strategy that was attempted against your unit in 2008, but now they're more sophisticated, Agent Park added. They're using social media, personnel records, even family information to identify high-value targets. Dr. Brennan swiped to another screen showing photographs of young soldiers. These are some of the technical specialists we've lost in the past year. Every one of them was specifically targeted because of their expertise in field maintenance and vehicle modification. The faces on the screen were heartbreakingly young, reminding Tasha of her own teammates from 15 years ago. She felt the familiar weight of survivor's guilt, but this time it was mixed with something else, a growing sense of obligation to prevent other families from experiencing the loss she'd witnessed. What exactly are you asking me to do? She asked quietly. Colonel Hayes straightened. We're asking you to head a new program, the Technical Personnel Protection Initiative. You'd be responsible for developing training protocols that teach our specialists how to recognize when they're being targeted and how to protect themselves and their units. It's not just consultation, Dr. Brennan added. We want you to establish a permanent training facility, develop curriculum, and personally train the instructors who'll carry your methods to units worldwide. The scope of the request was staggering. They weren't asking her to provide occasional advice, they were asking her to rebuild her entire life around military service, to become the kind of person she'd been before Kandahar destroyed everything. Where would this facility be located? She asked. That would be up to you, Colonel Hayes replied. The Pentagon is prepared to establish the training center wherever you think it would be most effective. Agent Mitchell stepped forward. Ms. Burke, we know this is a difficult decision, but you should know that the insurgent we captured specifically mentioned you by name. He called you the Ghost Mechanic and said that eliminating you had been a primary objective of their 2008 operations. The revelation hit Tasha like a physical blow. For 15 years, she'd believed she was hiding from her own trauma. Now she was learning that she'd been hiding from an enemy that had specifically wanted her dead. They knew who I was? She whispered. They knew exactly who you were, Lawson confirmed. Your innovations had made their job much more difficult. Eliminating you would have crippled multiple special forces units across the theater. Logan stepped forward from where he'd been listening near his workstation. Tasha, if they wanted you dead 15 years ago, and they're still using the same tactics now, doesn't that mean you're the person best qualified to stop them? The logic was simple and undeniable. She'd spent 15 years running from an enemy that had considered her valuable enough to hunt specifically. Now she had the opportunity to turn that knowledge against them, to protect the young soldiers whose faces reminded her so painfully of her lost teammates. If I do this, she said, slowly, if I establish this training program, I want certain conditions. Name them, Dr. Brennan said immediately. I want my team here involved. Logan, Tony, Caleb, they've watched me work for years. They understand my methods. If you want authentic field maintenance training, you need people who think like mechanics. Not just like soldiers, Colonel Hayes nodded. Acceptable. I want the program based here in Wyoming, or at least somewhere that feels like home. I've spent 15 years learning that stability matters for people dealing with trauma. The people we'll be training will need that same stability. Also acceptable, Dr. Brennan agreed. Tasha looked around at her co-workers, seeing in their faces the same mixture of pride and concern she'd once seen in her military teammates. These men had become her family, her anchor to civilian life. The idea of leaving them behind was almost as terrifying as the idea of re-entering military service. And I want Eddie to run the logistics side of the operation, she continued. He's the best manager I've ever worked with, and he understands how to take care of people. Eddie's weathered face flushed with surprise and pride. Tasha, I don't know anything about military operations. You know about taking care of people who work with their hands, she replied. You know about creating environments where people can do their best work. That's what we'll need. Colonel Hayes looked around the garage, taking in the obvious camaraderie and mutual respect among the staff. Ms. Burke, are you saying you'd like to build this training program around the team you already have here? I'm saying that the most important thing I learned in 15 years of civilian life is that talent comes in many forms, and the best teams are built on trust and mutual respect rather than rank and protocol. She paused, looking at each of the officials who'd come to recruit her. If you want me to train the next generation of military technical specialists, I'll do it my way with my people, in a place where we can build something lasting. Dr. Brennan smiled for the first time since entering the garage. Ms. Burke, I think we have a deal. As the officials began discussing details and logistics, Tasha felt a strange mixture of terror and anticipation. For 15 years she'd been running from her past, trying to become someone other than the soldier she'd once been. Now she was finally ready to integrate that past with the person she'd become, to use her knowledge and experience in service of something larger than her own fear. The quiet life was over, but maybe it was time for something more meaningful to begin. 6 weeks later, the transformation of Valley View Auto Service was nothing short of remarkable. What had once been a simple 4-bay garage had expanded into a sprawling complex that somehow managed to maintain its small-town character while serving a decidedly military purpose. The original garage remained largely unchanged, still handling civilian repairs and serving as the heart of the operation. But surrounding it, new buildings had sprouted like geometric flowers, each designed to serve the Technical Personnel Protection Initiative. Tasha walked through the main training facility at dawn, her boots echoing on polished concrete floors that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. The space was filled with vehicles in various states of disassembly, Humveys, MRAPs, and the latest generation of military transport vehicles, all serving as teaching tools for the specialized training program she'd spent the past month developing. "Morning, Professor," called out Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, one of the first students to arrive for the program. The title still felt strange to Tasha, but she'd grown accustomed to the mixture of respect and curiosity in the voices of the soldiers who'd come to learn from her. "Morning, Santos," Tasha replied, checking the diagnostic equipment that would be used in today's advanced troubleshooting session. "Ready for the pressure test scenario?" "As ready as anyone can be for whatever you're about to put us through," Santos replied with a grin. "The rumor mill says today's exercise involves simulating a breakdown in hostile territory with limited parts and tools." "The rumor mill is correct," Tasha confirmed. "But that's not the hard part. The hard part is recognizing when you're being set up for an ambush before it happens." The training program Tasha had developed went far beyond traditional military maintenance instruction. Drawing on her experience with ODA 527 and the intelligence gathered about insurgent targeting strategies, she'd created a curriculum that taught technical specialists to think like both mechanics and soldiers, to see their work not just as equipment maintenance but as a crucial element of operational security. Logan Hayes entered the training bay, carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of focused expression he'd developed since being named the program's civilian training coordinator. In 6 weeks, he'd transformed from an earnest small-town mechanic into someone who could discuss vehicle vulnerabilities and tactical maintenance protocols with decorated Special Forces veterans. "Tasha, we've got 12 new students arriving this afternoon," he reported. 4 from 5th Group, 3 from the 82nd Airborne, 2 Navy mechanics from SEAL teams, and 3 Marines from Force Recon. "What's their experience level?" Tasha asked, making notes on her lesson plan. Mixed bag, Logan replied, consulting his clipboard. The Special Forces guys have combat experience but limited advanced diagnostic training. The Navy mechanics are technically proficient but haven't worked in ground combat environments. The Marines... double quotes. He paused, grinning. The Marines say they can fix anything with duct tape and pure stubbornness. They're not wrong, Tasha said with the first genuine laugh she'd managed in weeks, but we'll teach them a few more options. Eddie. Kowalski appeared in the doorway of the training bay, his weathered face reflecting the satisfaction of a man who'd found his calling. As logistics coordinator for the expanded facility, he'd proven as capable of managing military contracts and security protocols as he'd been at running a small-town garage. Tasha, you've got a video conference with the Pentagon in 20 minutes, he announced. Something about expanding the program to include allied forces. Already? Tasha felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied reminders of how quickly her quiet life had been replaced by responsibilities that extended far beyond Wyoming. I thought we were going to get the domestic program fully operational before considering international expansion. Apparently, word of your methods has spread faster than anticipated, Eddie replied. Colonel Hayes mentioned that British, Canadian, and Australian Special Operations units are all requesting access to the training. The scope of interest was both gratifying and overwhelming. In 6 weeks, Tasha had gone from hiding her military expertise to being recognized as a leading authority on technical personnel protection. The transformation felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold. Tony Gutierrez emerged from beneath a partially disassembled Humvey, his coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd just solved a particularly challenging problem. Got it, he announced triumphantly. The hydraulic line routing that was causing the premature failures. Took me 3 tries. But I finally figured out the stress pattern that leads to catastrophic breakdown under combat conditions. Tony's transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. The quiet, methodical mechanic had discovered an intuitive understanding of failure analysis that impressed even veteran military engineers. His insights into how equipment degraded under combat stress had already led to 2 significant modifications in vehicle design standards. Good work, Tasha said, making a note to include Tony's discovery in the afternoon's lesson plan. That kind of pattern recognition is exactly what we need to teach. Caleb Fisher looked up from the computer terminal where he was reviewing diagnostic software protocols. Tasha, I've been thinking about the psychological profiling component of the program. If insurgents are specifically targeting technical personnel, shouldn't we be teaching them to recognize behavioral surveillance as well as technical threats? The suggestion was insightful and slightly unsettling. Caleb had always been the most analytical member of the team, but his recent immersion in military threat assessment had revealed a mind capable of thinking in terms of operational security and enemy tactics. That's actually a very good point, Tasha replied. We've been focusing on technical vulnerabilities, but human intelligence gathering is probably a bigger threat. I could develop a module on personal security awareness, Caleb continued. How to recognize when you're being watched, how to vary your routines, how to protect information about your capabilities and assignments. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Command Sergeant Major Lawson, who'd become a regular presence at the facility as the military liaison for the program. His expression was more serious than usual, carrying the weight of news that Tasha suspected she wouldn't want to hear. Ma'am, he said formally, we need to discuss the intelligence briefing I received this morning. Tasha felt her stomach tighten. What kind of intelligence? The kind that suggests your program is already having an impact, Lawson replied. 3 separate insurgent communications. Intercepts in the past week have mentioned the American training facility and discussed strategies for countering what they call enhanced technical security protocols. The revelation was both gratifying and terrifying. The training program was working well enough to attract enemy attention, which meant it was also working well enough to make enemies. Are we compromised? Eddie asked, his businessman's instincts immediately focusing on the practical implications. Not directly, Lawson assured him. But the enemy is aware that something has changed in how we're training and deploying technical personnel. They're adapting their tactics accordingly. Logan looked around the group with the expression of someone processing new and unsettling information. So we're in an arms race. We develop better training. They develop better targeting strategies. That's exactly what we're in, Tasha confirmed. Which means we can't afford to become complacent or predictable. As if to emphasize her point, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple but chilling. The ghost mechanic has been found. This time, there will be no escape. The blood drained from Tasha's face as she read the message aloud. The training facility, which had felt like a sanctuary where she could use her knowledge to protect others, suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. "Ma'am," Lawson said quietly, "I think it's time we discussed personal security protocols for you and your team." The war had followed her home once again, but this time she wouldn't be facing it alone. This time, she had a team, a mission, and 15 years of hard-won wisdom to guide her through whatever came next. The transformation from hiding to fighting was complete, but the real battle was just beginning. The security briefing took place in what had once been Eddie's office, but now served as the facility's command center. Maps covered the walls, marked with locations of deployed graduates from the Technical Personnel Protection Initiative. Computer screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds, and a secure communication system connected the Wyoming facility to military commands worldwide. Agent Mitchell sat at the conference table alongside Colonel Hayes, Command Sergeant Major Lawson, and a new face, a lean man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in dangerous places. "This is Jack Morrison, formerly Delta Force, now with the Defense Intelligence Agency," Colonel Hayes said by way of introduction. "He's here to assess the threat level against this facility and your team." Morrison studied Tasha with the clinical attention of a professional threat assessor. "Ms. Burke, the message you received this morning wasn't random. The phone number it came from was traced to a known insurgent cell operating out of Syria. The fact that they have your personal number suggests a significant intelligence gathering operation." Eddie shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "How significant are we talking about?" "The kind that involves months of surveillance, social media, monitoring, and possibly human intelligence assets," Morrison replied bluntly. "They know where you live, where you work, probably where you shop and what routes you take to get around town." Logan looked around the room with growing concern. "Are we talking about an imminent attack? We're talking about an enemy that has demonstrated the capability to plan and execute complex operations against high-value targets," Agent Mitchell answered. "The fact that they're making contact suggests they're moving from surveillance to action." Tasha felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "So my decision to start this program has put everyone here at risk." "Your decision to start this program has already saved lives," Colonel Hayes corrected firmly. 3 of our graduates reported suspicious activities around their forward operating bases last week. Using the threat recognition training you developed, they identified and neutralized surveillance teams before attacks could be launched. Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed them satellite imagery of a military compound in an unidentified desert location. This forward operating base in eastern Syria would have been overrun if the technical personnel hadn't recognized the signs of impending attack. 14 soldiers are alive today because of the training they received here. The vindication was gratifying but also sobering. Success in saving some lives had apparently made Tasha and her team targets for those who wanted to prevent future successes. "What are our options?" Tony asked, his voice steady despite the obvious concern in his eyes. Option 1 is to shut down the facility and disappear again, Morrison said. New identities, new locations, complete separation from anything connected. To military operations. That's not an option, Tasha replied immediately. Too many people depend on this training now. Option 2 is to turn this place into a fortress, Morrison continued. 24-hour security, restricted access, armed guards, the whole military installation package. Eddie shook his head. That would destroy everything we've built here. This program works because it feels like a real workplace, not a military base. Students learn better when they're not constantly reminded that someone's trying to kill them. Which brings us to option 3, Morrison said, with what might have been approval. We make you too valuable to kill. Caleb looked puzzled. How? Do you make someone too valuable to kill? By making sure that eliminating any individual, even Tasha, wouldn't significantly impact the program's effectiveness, Morrison explained. We distribute the knowledge, cross-train multiple instructors, establish redundant capabilities. Logan straightened in his chair. You're talking about making us all targets instead of just Tasha. I'm talking about making the program bigger than any individual, Morrison corrected. Right now, Tasha is a single point of failure. Remove her, and the program dies. But if we have trained instructors at multiple locations, using standardized curricula, operating independently, then killing one person doesn't stop the mission, Tasha finished. It's actually brilliant. Instead of protecting the individual, you protect the capability. Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly. The Pentagon has already approved funding for 5 additional training facilities. We want to accelerate that timeline, get them operational within 6 months instead of 2 years. That's a massive undertaking, Eddie observed. We'd need to train instructors, develop standardized materials, establish security protocols for multiple sites. Which is why we're also implementing option 4, Agent Mitchell said with a slight smile. We're going to let them try. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. You want to use us as bait, Tasha said quietly. We want to use this facility as a controlled environment for a counterintelligence operation, Morrison clarified. Let them come, but on our terms, with our preparation, in a place where we have every advantage. Tony looked around the room incredulously. You want to turn our garage into a battlefield? We want to turn your training facility into a trap, Morrison replied. The intelligence we've gathered suggests they're planning a coordinated attack, designed to eliminate key personnel and destroy training materials. If we can predict when and how they'll strike, we can be ready for them. And if you're wrong, Logan asked. If they come at us in ways you don't predict, then we fall back on 15 years of Special Forces experience, 6 weeks of intensive security preparation, and the fact that this team has already proven they can adapt to impossible situations, Morrison said, looking directly at Tasha. Caleb had been quiet throughout the briefing, but now he spoke up with characteristic analytical precision. What's the timeline for this theoretical attack? Based on communication intercepts and movement patterns, we estimate 2 to 3 weeks, Agent Mitchell replied. Long enough for us to prepare, not long enough for them to significantly change their operational planning. Tasha stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had sheltered her for 15 years. The peaks looked the same as they had the day she'd first arrived in Harmony Springs, but everything else had changed beyond recognition. If we do this, she said without turning around, if we turn this place into a trap, what happens to the town? What happens to the people who've supported us? We evacuate non-essential personnel, Morrison replied. Create a security perimeter. Coordinate with local law enforcement. Make sure civilian casualties are minimized. And after? Eddie asked. Assuming we survive this theoretical battle, what then? Colonel Hayes answered. Then you become legends. The training facility that fought off a terrorist attack becomes a symbol of American resilience and determination. Recruitment goes through the roof, funding becomes unlimited, and the program expands globally. Or we become martyrs, Logan sighed grimly. Dead heroes whose sacrifice inspires others to carry on the mission. Those are the stakes, Morrison confirmed without emotion. But consider the alternative. If they succeed in eliminating this facility and key personnel, they set back American technical training capabilities by decades. More importantly, they send a message that targeting our specialists is an effective strategy. Tasha turned back to face the room, her expression reflecting 15 years of hard-won wisdom and 6 weeks of renewed purpose. How long do we have to decide? The preparations begin immediately regardless of your decision, Agent Mitchell said. The question is whether you're willing to be active participants in the operation, or whether you'd prefer to be evacuated to safety while others handle the threat. The choice was really no choice at all. Tasha had spent 15 years running from her responsibilities as a soldier. Now she had the opportunity to face those responsibilities head-on, with a team she trusted and a mission she believed in. We stay, she said firmly. We fight. And we make sure that no one else has to go through what I went through after Kandahar. The room erupted in voices planning, questioning, preparing. But through the chaos, Tasha felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since 2008, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The battle for the Technical Personnel Protection Initiative was about to begin. The next 2 weeks transformed the training facility into something that resembled a military installation more than a garage, though Eddie had insisted they maintain the outward appearance of normal operations. During the day, classes continued as scheduled, with students learning advanced diagnostic techniques and threat recognition protocols. At night, after the trainees had returned to their temporary barracks, a different kind of preparation took place. Tasha walked the perimeter at 03:00 hours, her boots crunching softly on gravel as she checked the concealed surveillance equipment that had been installed around the facility. The infrared cameras were invisible to casual observation, but would provide complete coverage of any approach to the buildings. Motion sensors disguised as landscape lighting would alert the command center to any unauthorized movement. Can't sleep either? Logan's voice came from the shadows near the main training building. Too much to think about, Tasha replied, joining him on what had become an unofficial midnight patrol route. In 2 weeks, Logan had transformed from an earnest mechanic into someone who carried himself with the quiet confidence of a person prepared for violence. The change was both impressive and somewhat unsettling. Morrison thinks they'll come from the east, Logan said, scanning the tree line that bordered that side of the property. Use the river approach to avoid the main roads. Morrison thinks a lot of things, Tasha replied. But 15 years ago, I learned that the enemy gets a vote in how operations unfold. They might surprise us. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft beep of Logan's radio. Perimeter check, all stations report, came Jack Morrison's voice through the encrypted channel. Station 1, all clear, Tasha responded. Station 2, movement in Sector 7, came Tony's voice from his position near the vehicle storage area. Looks like a deer, but confirming. Station 3, negative contact, Caleb reported from the communications building. Station 4. All quiet, Eddie added from his position overlooking the main entrance. The routine had become second nature, but tonight felt different. Intelligence reports suggested the attack would come within the next 72 hours, and everyone could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. Tasha, Logan said quietly, can I ask you something? Sure. That night in Kandahar, when your team was killed, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd been with them? The question was one she'd asked herself thousands of times over the past 15 years. Every day for the first 5 years. Every week for the next 5. Now, maybe once a month. And what conclusion did you reach? Tasha considered the question carefully. 2 weeks ago, she might have given a different answer, one colored by guilt and survivor's remorse. But the preparation for this potential attack had clarified something important about the nature of service and sacrifice. I think I would have died with them, she said finally. And I think that would have been the end of it. No training program, no lives saved, no innovations that are still protecting soldiers today. My death would have been honorable, but it wouldn't have been useful. Logan nodded thoughtfully. Morrison said something similar yesterday. He said that sometimes the hardest thing about being a soldier isn't dying for your country, it's living for it. Before Tasha could respond, her radio crackled with urgent communication. All stations, this is command. We have multiple vehicles approaching from the north, no lights, moving tactical. This is not a drill. The words sent adrenaline coursing through Tasha's system as 15 years of military training reasserted itself. Logan, get to your position. Remember the plan. They separated without another word, each moving to predetermined positions that had been rehearsed dozens of times over the past 2 weeks. Tasha's station was the main training building, where she had both visual command of the approaches and access to the secure communications equipment that would coordinate their response. Through her night vision scope, she could see vehicles approaching across the open ground north of the facility. 3 pickup trucks, moving without lights in a tactical formation that spoke of military training and careful planning. Command Station 1, she whispered into her radio. I count 3. Vehicles, approximately 12 personnel. They're using the approach we anticipated. Copy, Station 1. Morrison's voice came back calm and controlled. All stations, execute Plan Alpha. Remember, we want them to commit fully before we reveal our capabilities. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Allow the attackers to begin their assault, let them believe they had achieved surprise, then demonstrate that they had walked into a carefully prepared trap. The psychological impact of realizing they'd been anticipated and outmaneuvered would be as important as the tactical victory. Tasha watched through her scope as figures emerged from the vehicles and began moving toward the buildings in a coordinated assault formation. Their movements were professional, suggesting military or paramilitary training. These weren't amateur terrorists, they were skilled operators who had planned this attack carefully. Station 2, I have eyes on 4 individuals moving toward the vehicle storage area, Tony reported. They're carrying what appears to be explosive devices. Station 3, 2 personnel approaching the communications building, Caleb added. They're using proper tactical movement, staying in shadows. Station 4, the remaining 6 are moving toward the main entrance, Eddie reported. They appear to be the primary assault element. Morrison's voice came through the radio with quiet authority. All stations, stand by. Let them get closer. We want to be sure we have all of them before we light them up. Tasha felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded combat. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady as she adjusted her position and confirmed her fields of fire. The months of preparation had led to this moment, and she was as ready as she could be. Through her scope, she could see the lead elements of the assault team reaching the main building. They moved with confidence, apparently believing they had achieved complete surprise. In 30 seconds, they would learn otherwise. All stations, Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper. Execute, execute, execute. The night exploded into chaos as floodlights illuminated the entire facility, temporarily blinding the attackers and revealing their positions. Simultaneously, loudspeakers around the perimeter began broadcasting a message in Arabic, English, and Pashto. You are surrounded by United States military forces. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately. The attackers' response was immediate and violent. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions as they sought cover and tried to continue their assault despite being exposed and outnumbered. Tasha had hoped they would surrender when faced with overwhelming tactical disadvantage. Instead, they chose to fight, which meant she and her team would have to fight back. The Battle of Valley View Auto Service had begun, and there would be no going back to the quiet life she'd once known. "All stations weapons free," Morrison commanded. "Protect the facility. Protect each other. Show them what happens when they threaten American soldiers." Tasha took aim through her scope, her finger finding the trigger as muscle memory from 3. Combat deployments took over. 15 years after Kandahar, she was a soldier again, fighting not just for survival, but for the mission that had given her life meaning. The war had followed her home, but this time she was ready for it. The firefight lasted 17 minutes, though it felt like hours to Tasha as she moved through the training facility, coordinating defensive positions and providing covering fire for her teammates. The attackers had been skilled and determined, but they had walked into a trap designed by professionals who understood both their capabilities and their limitations. When the shooting stopped, 8 of the 12 attackers were dead. 3 were wounded and in custody, and 1 had escaped into the mountains. More importantly, none of Tasha's team had suffered serious injuries, though Tony had taken a graze across his shoulder that he insisted was nothing more than a scratch from working on a stubborn carburetor. Now 3 hours after the attack, the facility buzzed with activity as federal agents processed the scene and military personnel secured evidence. The local sheriff had arrived with backup from the state police, their faces reflecting the surreal nature of a military-style assault. In rural Wyoming, Tasha sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the familiar mixture of exhaustion and hypervigilance that followed combat. She was alive, her team was safe, and the mission would continue, but the cost of that success was still being calculated. "Ma'am," Command Sergeant Major Lawson approached with an expression that mixed relief with professional satisfaction. "I wanted to update you on what we learned from the prisoners." "What did they tell you?" Tasha asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "They confirmed what we suspected. This wasn't just about eliminating you personally. It was about stopping the training program entirely. They had intelligence on your methods, your curriculum, even the locations of the planned expansion facilities. The revelation was both disturbing and oddly validating. So we really were making a difference. You were making enough of a difference that a sophisticated terrorist organization spent months planning an operation to stop you," Lawson confirmed. "I'd say that qualifies as success." Logan approached, his young face showing the strain of the past few hours, but also something that looked like pride. "Tasha, Agent Mitchell wants to debrief us about the defensive tactics we used. Apparently, some of our innovations are going to be incorporated into facility security protocols worldwide. The idea that their improvised defensive measures would be studied and replicated felt surreal." "We just did what seemed logical," Tasha replied. "What seemed logical to a team of people with military experience, mechanical expertise, and 15 years of accumulated wisdom," Eddie corrected, joining the group. His weathered face showed the strain of the night's events, but his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd helped protect something important. Colonel Hayes appeared with Jack Morrison and Agent Mitchell, their expressions reflecting the complex emotions of a successful but costly operation. "Miss Burke," the colonel said formally, "I wanted to personally thank you and your team for your courage and professionalism tonight." "Just doing our job," Tasha replied, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what they'd experienced. "Your job was to train military personnel in threat recognition and vehicle maintenance," Morrison pointed out. "What you did tonight went considerably beyond those duties." Agent Mitchell consulted her tablet. The intelligence we've gathered from this operation has already led to actionable information about terrorist networks in 3 different countries. The impact of tonight's success will be felt for years to come. Tony and Caleb joined the group, both showing the effects of their first combat experience, but carrying themselves with new confidence. The night had transformed them from civilian mechanics into something harder to define, still civilians, but ones who had proven they could stand and fight when necessary. What happens now? Caleb asked, his analytical mind already moving toward the practical implications of the night's events. Now we rebuild, expand, and continue the mission, Colonel Hayes replied. The attack tonight proved that what you're doing here is too important to abandon. The Pentagon is prepared to provide whatever resources you need to make this program everything it can become. Tasha looked around at her team, Eddie with his paternal concern, Logan with his earnest determination, Tony with his practical wisdom, and Caleb with his analytical precision. These men had started as co-workers and become family, had evolved from civilian mechanics into something approaching a military unit without losing the qualities that made them special. Colonel, she said slowly, I appreciate the support, but I need you to understand something. This program works because it's built on civilian values as much as military ones. It works because we treat people like individuals, not just soldiers. It works because we remember that the goal isn't just to create better mechanics, it's to create better human beings. I understand, Colonel Hayes replied. And I want you to know that the Pentagon agrees. The expansion facilities will be built around the model you've established here. Your methods, your values, your approach to balancing military necessity with human dignity. As the sun rose over the mountains, casting long shadows across the battle-scarred facility, Tasha felt a sense of completion that had been missing from her life for 15 years. The guilt over Kandahar hadn't disappeared. It might never disappear entirely, but it had been transformed into something useful, something that honored the memory of her fallen teammates while protecting the lives of current soldiers. Ma'am, Lawson said quietly, there's something else you should know. The families of ODA 527, the families of your teammates who died in Kandahar, they've been following news of your program. They wanted me to give you this. He handed her a letter, and she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Sarah Chun, the wife of Sergeant First Class David Chun, the team's communications specialist. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and read, Dear Tasha, we've been searching for you for 15 years, not to blame you, but to thank you. David wrote to me about you in his last letter, about how your expertise and dedication kept the team safe through dozens of missions. He called you the guardian angel who made sure they always came home. We know you've been carrying guilt about what happened, but we want you to know that we've never blamed you. We've always been grateful that someone who loved our husbands and sons as much as we did was there to take care of them. We're proud of what you're doing now, proud that David's sacrifice contributed to something that continues to save lives. He would be honored to know that his death helped create the program that will protect future soldiers. With love and gratitude, the families of ODA 527. Tears ran down Tasha's face as she finished reading, but for the first time in 15 years, they weren't tears of guilt or regret. They were tears of release, of forgiveness finally received and accepted. Ma'am, Morrison said gently, are you ready to continue the mission? Tasha looked around at the facility that had become her life's work, at the team that had become her chosen family, at the mountains that had sheltered her journey from broken veteran to whole human being. I'm ready, she said, her voice strong and clear. Let's train some soldiers. 6 months later, the Technical Personnel Protection Initiative operated training facilities in 12 locations across 4 countries. Graduates of the program had prevented dozens of attacks, saved hundreds of lives, and revolutionized the way military technical personnel understood their role in modern warfare. But for Tasha Burke, The real victory wasn't measured in statistics or accolades. It was measured in the knowledge that she had finally found a way to honor her fallen teammates while building something lasting and meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. The quiet life was gone forever, but the life that had replaced it was richer, more purposeful, and more connected to the values she'd always believed in. She had learned that healing didn't come from hiding from the past, but from using that past to build a better future. In the end, that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.